I feel like a lot of people have an idea of healing, but no one actually heals. What you do and the things that you're accepting is a lot more than just moving on. I feel like when we do have a bad situation, so many times people just move on and don't really do anything. When I feel like truly healing is accepting everything that happened, and that includes the role you played in your suffering. I feel like a lot of times when it comes to accepting our flaws and things, it can be very hard to see, but there's always two sides of a story. And if we're only healing from things where we feel like we weren't in the wrong or we were, then what are we really doing? I feel like each time we're trying to heal or actively in this healing phase, it's important that we note this. I feel like a lot of times we can confuse the healing phase from avoiding accountability or just ghosting people, when I feel like that's immature. I don't think that's something we can actively do if we're truly trying to heal and process through something. I feel like that's kind of just leaving it dormant and not really knowing what will come next. I feel like if we truly do want to heal, we'll accept our flaws. We'll accept everything that we've done in this situation that made it fall. I feel like if we truly do want to experience good things, then we'll have this mindset, of being accountable for all these things in the situation when we do want to move on. I feel like each time we're actively trying to heal, it can very be lopsided. I feel like so many times we kind of confuse what we actually did and what we actually wanted from what actually happened. I feel like having a open mind in these perceptions would make it a lot easier. If we truly did want to have a good idea of things, and we will note that. I feel like we actually have to really try to move on in these situations rather than acting like it never happened. I feel like it's a lot easier for people to kind of just remove or replace people just to kind of move on and claim it's healing, when really you're just leaving. You're leaving a wound open, and I feel like that's really a big problem. It's definitely unfortunate. It's a lot easier said than done, but I do feel like if we truly want to heal, that's what we'd actively be doing. I feel like that's something that's there, that's very much present in the world of healing. And I feel like even when we are healing, a lot of times we hold grudges, and I feel like holding a grudge is really just holding someone prisoner and kind of waiting for things to change. I feel like a lot of times we're not actually holding grudges against people, but we're holding a grudge against ourselves. We're allowing this person to affect us this much to where we allow to store hatred and despise them and dislike people just because of a situation or a scenario. I feel like a lot of times it can be very hard to move past things, but I do feel like forgiveness is key. I don't think you have to forgive people and act like it never happened, but I do think you should remember things. I think forgiving people and realizing that this person shouldn't be allowed in my life is definitely a part of that. I feel like it's definitely okay and mature enough to accept people for who they are while moving on with no hatred or no backlash or really no underlining message. I feel like a lot of times when we're holding on to that much hatred and despisement towards people, we're actively hurting ourselves. That's the person who's getting affected the most in this situation is us, because a lot of times they won't have that same grudge against us. They won't have this hatred. They won't have this suffering, when really we're just impeding it on ourselves because we're not over a certain situation. And I feel like that's what's the most unfortunate thing about it, is that active hatred. If we truly do want to heal, we want to have any of that. I feel like it's one thing to kind of have bad things going for you, but when you're actively roaming around with this hatred in your heart, it's gonna hurt. I feel like if we truly do want to move on, that's what we have to see. We definitely have to start accepting people for who they are. Not this potential or this over romanticized version you have, or this version that you really want, that you're actively trying to pursue. We have to accept them for who they are. Decide all the gimmicks and everything. I feel like a lot of times we're only staying with people or chasing people because we have this idea of them in their head, or maybe it's who they used to be that you're still clinging on to. I feel like a lot of times when we say we miss people, we're clinging on to this version of them that's not even there. A lot of times we miss someone, and that someone doesn't even exist anymore. It's a past fragment of someone. It's their past or something we really want to see in the future that we won't actually get to experience again. I feel like a lot of times it's very hard to move on in that situation, but when we're actively looking at things saying, oh, I know they'll improve in the future, and we're not actively seeing that change, then what are we doing? I do think it's important to be guiding and helpful to your partner to really help them grow, but if they're not open to that change, if they're not trying to change for you, then they're not for you. I feel like a lot of times love will really never fail, and if we actively keep doing things just because we see potential in people, then when do we draw the line? When do we know it's enough to stop talking to someone? I feel like a lot of times it's really easy to get caught up in that just because you're not fully aware of what you should be doing or what you can be doing, in a situation. And it sucks. It definitely does suck, but I do feel like it's better than hurting yourself in the long run. I do feel like a lot of times we're actively hurting ourselves for creating problems just because we're not sure of what to do. But I feel like if we're doing things for ourselves, that's what's really important. You know, actively trying new things is definitely something that can help us in our long run of healing. You know, the healing journey is a lot more about the journey than the destination. I feel like if we're only focused on things because we want to feel a certain way at the end, what are we actively doing? You know, I feel like you definitely have to have an idea beyond yourself. You know, you have to have this perception that you can not only be healing but healed, you know, and that healing can translate to other people. You know, a lot of times we can heal other people as long as we're not hurting ourselves actively. You know, a lot of times it's like chasing that version, like I said earlier, but I do feel like it's important to have that side of you that's open to healing and open to new ideas. You know, I do think it's very important. It's unfortunate seeing how people move towards it, but I do think it's something we can actively pursue. You know, it's something we can actively do. I feel like if we realize that, it'd be a lot easier for ourselves. You know, we wouldn't have as much hatred in our heart. It'd really just be optimism and a healthy, you know, genuine connection. I feel like a lot of times we should realize that helping other people only helps ourselves. You know, there's no flaw or con in helping other people. You know, when you light the path for someone else, you can't not help but light your own path. You know, I feel like a lot of times if we're actively trying to do things, we can look not only beyond ourselves, but we can look at the people around us, you know, while still being able to offer that love and support and genuine connection to people. We can actively heal ourselves. You know, I feel like a lot of times trying to heal people is something that broken people do just because you want someone to heal you so bad. You know, I feel like a lot of times if we're really wanting to experience something good, we'll actively be that good. You know, we'll actively be that love that we're wishing to show people. You know, a lot of times I feel like that love or that energy you put into chasing people would be a lot better in pouring into people that are actually there for you. You know, your friends, your family, even yourself. I feel like it's something people really disregard. You know, I feel like you don't have to be in a relationship to experience love in your life. You know, that love is omnipresent. It's something that you can show, you can demonstrate, and you can also receive just from people, you know, whether that be platonic or through a family. You know, I think it's very important that we note that. If we truly do want to heal, we would take this into account. You know, we'd actively heal ourselves while actively being available for our people around us. You know, it's more than a journey. Like I said, I feel like healing is kind of a emotional and spiritual state that a lot of people should tap into. It's very important. And I feel like if we actively want to heal, we would know that and we would try it.